The Cybersecurity Risk Assessment by Group 4, Team New Zealand. This presentation will cover authentication, authorization, access controls, common vulnerabilities of a network such as people, technologies, and policies, mitigation recommendations, and we'll conclude by performing a brief recap. Users accessing the network need to be authenticated. Authentication is the process of verifying the identity of a user or process connecting to a network resource. For instance, a user initiates a transaction. The critical or sensitive information is secured using a data-in-transit encryption algorithm. The response is displayed on a trusted reader. Subsequently, the end user approves the transaction via a secure keypad. This is done with a digital signature that is applied to the request. The signature is taken from a smart card where it is stored. By executing all of the critical operations of a secure reader, it helps prevent manipulation attacks with the involvement of the user. It performs three major tasks. The first is to manage the connection between the network and the user. Second is to verify the user identity. Third is to grant or deny access based on the credentials submitted by the user. Authentication is important because it prevents unauthorized access to the network, as well as prevents the unintended disclosure of proprietary information. There are three different types of user authentication. The first is the knowledge factor. This is something that the user knows. For instance, this could be a username, password, or PIN. The second is going to be something that the user possesses. So this is called the possession factor. For instance, this is a one-time password token, key fobs, ID cards, or smart card. The third is inheritance factor. This is something that the user is, or biological characteristics of the user. So some of the characteristics would be a fingerprint or retina scanning or facial recognition. Single-factor authentication relies on one factor only to provide the authentication. Typically, this is a basic username and password scenario. More commonly and more secure is going to be the multi-factor authentication, which is based on two or more factors. For instance, username and password, as well as a PIN that would be located on a USB token, or a username and password and the PIN that would be supplied via email that is sent out from the system. Authorization. Authorization is the process of determining whether a user has the authority to issue commands. For instance, it is the process of enforcing policies that determine what type or qualities of activities, resources, or services a user is permitted to perform. Authorization occurs within the context of authentication. So once the user has been authenticated, he or she is placed into a role, and based on that role, they're allowed to perform certain tasks and only those tasks, and nothing above that access level. Authorization measures can be implemented based on the Open System Interconnection, or OSI model. First is a null authorization. This is the user has no authorization at all on the system. The second is performing layer 2 segmentation or network segmentation. It is accomplished by implementing VLANs based on departments, thus adding a layer of defense by making it harder for users to access system areas that they are not allowed or authorized to be in. Next would be network traffic filtering by controlling access through access control layers. Apples are implemented in the perimeter and interior firewalls. Finally, authorization measures would be put into place at the application layer. This would be assigning user entitlements. Access control. The purpose of access control is to control user access to confidential information to those individuals that have a need to know. Second is preventing a system access to unauthorized users. There are four main categories of access control. The first is going to be mandatory access control. This is restricting access based on sensitive information. DAC, or discretionary access control. This is applying access control policies that restricts access to objects based on the user identity. Role-based access control, or RBAC, is restricting access based on user roles and permissions. And rule-based access control is policies that are enforced to restrict access by a defined set of rules. This is its proprietary data. It is this data that empowers a business to produce its product line. Organizations must be vigilant and to protect its data from malicious or unintended loss. It must safeguard it from three common vulnerabilities: people, policies, and technologies. There are three categories under the people area. There's human error, insider threats, and cyber criminals. Human error are mistakes that are made by trusted individuals. For example, an employee that is multitasking inadvertently sends confidential information to an external partner or customer because they have responded to the wrong email with proprietary attachments. This mistake is not an intentional mistake, but it is very costly to an organization as well as its brand, potentially. Insider threats. Insider threats are employees or other persons of trust that maliciously cause damage to an organization. For example, it is an employee that steals system architecture or other specifications with the intent to gain financially by selling that information to the organization's competitor or to do damage to the organization. Cyber criminals are experts at hacking identities. Some accomplish this by compromising an employee's system through malware, phishing attacks. Some leverage stolen credentials, especially by gleaning data from social networks. There are a plethora of technology vulnerabilities. OWASP puts out a list of top 10 common vulnerabilities that each organization should scan their system for. We'll be discussing three. The first is going to be sensitive data exposure. This occurs anytime that an end user has access to sensitive information that it should not have access to. Buffer overflows. This is the condition where the application has allocated a certain size to hold information and it receives more than that size, causing the system to break. Injection vulnerabilities. This occurs anytime an application receives unvalidated information. Injection flaws can occur and they're very common. The most popular ones are SQL injections, LDAP, and cross-site scripting injections. Abilities can be vast when it comes to policies. The policy can be too specific or too vague, thus not covering everything necessary for a certain cybercrime. The laws in place when it comes to cyber crimes are sometimes too complicated and thus making it hard for the policy to focus on the real criminal act. The second part is that technology is growing at such a rapid pace that it's hard for organizations to keep the policies current. And lastly, the inexperienced employee who's writing the policy may not have the skills or the managing necessary to do the job to write a thorough policy, thus creating loopholes. Mitigation recommendations. It is recommended to provide ongoing training on the different types of attacks that are present and how to identify malicious activity, to perform routine software patching and updates, to update the current policy relative to current security standards, and then perform periodic reassessments of the TOD and TOEs for efficiency and make updates based on the outcome of those reassessments. To reduce the threat vectors present given the several people vulnerabilities, it is recommended that we implement the following: mandatory vacations to give individuals a break so they're not stressed out. Separation of duties. Separation of duties is strict. If you're a database administrator, then you should not be performing software or system administration roles. Second would be restricted areas that the employee can access based on his job functions. Ongoing trainings to recognize the different threats and malicious attacks and how to prevent them. And restrict working hours to a certain set of core hours. And also a periodic rotation of duties to keep the individual fresh and to limit the insider threat. As we suggested before, there are a plethora of vulnerabilities that afflict the technology side of a corporation. So we are recommending a defense in depth approach to reduce the vulnerability from being exploited. With that goes, we're suggesting a strong authentication process using multi-factor authentication. That would be a username and password, and certs, the PKI certs or smart card. The authorization process would be using RBAC controls. And nightly network scanning to identify any unusual network traffic on the network. Quarterly vulnerability scanning and subsequent patching of the software. Disabling insecure ports. And reconfiguring our IDP to more of a heuristic approach. And finally, the installation of a data loss prevention software. To help protect against the policy vulnerability, it is recommended that we implement a acceptable use policy and flow that information out to the users and have them agree by signing and have that reviewed on an annual basis. And a limited right to privacy when using company equipment or when you're present on the company network. Thirdly is going to be an intellectual property policy, discussing that the information that is contained within the corporation belongs to the corporation. Second would be annual reassessments of the policies with regards to the current cyber laws and privacy laws in place and making adjustments accordingly. And implementing a security-focused or security-centric software development lifecycle for our products. In conclusion, the presentation focused on authentication. Authentication is the process of establishing and managing a connection between the user and the network, verifying user identity, and providing access based on the credentials provided by the end user. Once the user has been authenticated, they are authorized for different services. This authorization is based on access granted by the access control list, and this list is the reinforcement of policies and roles. There are three common vulnerabilities present for any organization. First is going to be the people vulnerability. This is human error, which is the cause of data breach, internal and external. Threats, which is the intended or the unintended release of its company information. Technology vulnerabilities are either programmatic or the exposure to sensitive data by an unauthorized end user. The policy vulnerabilities are ineffective, irrelevant, and outdated policies, or a policy writer who does not have the experience to produce loophole-free policies. The high-level recommendations to mitigate the aforementioned vulnerabilities is ongoing user training, continuous system monitoring, and periodic reassessment of the policies for applicabilities to the current laws and technologies. Thank you.